Okay, good evening. I'll introduce myself in just one moment, but first I'd like to make an announcement about this space's accessibility. The community room is T-coil enabled. If you have T-coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-coil enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, we have made some available at a table in the back of the room. I'll also request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of this program. My name is Cliff Robinson, and I am the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. Tonight's program was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's my honor to introduce our two guests tonight, Michael Cook and Sadaf Jaffer. Michael Cook is the class of 1943 University Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. His research investigates the formation of Islamic civilization and the role of religious values in that process. His distinguished record of publication not only includes such indispensable scholarly resources as Early Muslim Dogma, a source-critical study, Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong in Islamic Thought, awarded the Albert Hourani Book Award, and the 6-volume New Cambridge History of Islam, winner of the 2011 Waldo G. Leland Prize. It also features magisterial syntheses written for general audiences, such as Is the Quran, a very short introduction, and A Brief History of the Human Race. This evening we're here to learn about his forthcoming title, A History of the Muslim World from Its Origins to the Dawn of Modernity, a book which we have in advance of its pub date. So thanks to PUP for making that available, and thanks to Labyrinth for being here to handle sales and signings tonight. So this work straddles both domains. It's written in an engaging style and thoughtfully developed. The work nevertheless sprawls to treat so vast a terrain and in such depth that it will doubtless be an essential resource for specialist scholars as well. Michael is joined in conversation tonight by Sadaf Jaffer, a scholar and policy expert with more than 15 years of public engagement, higher education, and governmental expertise. Jaffer is Associate Research Scholar and Lecturer at Princeton University, where she teaches courses on South Asian, Islamic, and Asian American studies. Her research focuses on secular feminist and activist movements in South Asian Muslim and diasporic context, with particular attention to the arts, literature, and popular culture. She has also published with the Star Ledger, The Hill, the Journal of Women's History, Foreign Policy Research Institute, The Huffington Post, Alt Muslima, and American Kahani. Jaffer previously served as New Jersey State Legislature she's previously served in New Jersey State Legislature, where she represented the 16th Legislative District as the first Asian American woman with Ellen Park and Shama Hyder, and the first Muslim American with Shama Hyder to serve in the New Jersey Legislature. Jaffer serves on numerous boards and commissions, including for the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, Oxfam America, and the Princeton University Art Museum. Please welcome Michael Cook and Sadaf Jaffer.
Okay, what I'm going to do is say a few things for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll sit down again and Sadaf will take over. And the first thing I want to say is thank you all round. Thank you to the people at Labyrinth, the people here at the library, the people at the press who helped to make this event happen. Thank you to Cliff for presiding. A big thank you to Sadaf for being willing to partner with me in this. And thank you all for being here at a time when you could have been lots of other places. And I have to say by way of apology that I prepared a talk that I think is going to be good enough for people who are sitting down, but I'm not sure it's really good enough for people standing. I appreciate that. Okay, so let's get down to business. Supposing you were to shell out $40 and buy this book, what do you actually get? Well, at the most basic level...
Some light reading.
That's right. But at the most basic level, what you get is a nickel in change and over 900 pages. And I'm acutely embarrassed about that. Not about the nickel, about the 900 pages. I think it was 24 years ago, I published a very long book. And in the preface, I promised never to do that again. And I'm sorry to say that this is the second time I've broken that promise. So please, let's forget about the length and come to the content. Okay, so what you get is a history of the Muslim world. That's what the title says. This history gives you fairly systematic coverage of the history of the Muslim world from the beginning to, say, around about 1800. That's what the subtitle is trying to tell you, but the problem is that the press doesn't like dates in subtitles. So I had to find a sort of very roundabout way of saying that. So coverage from the beginning to about 1800, reasonably systematically. But that whole core of the book is bookended by a couple of chapters. There's one chapter at the beginning where I back up into late antiquity in order to set the scene for the emergence of the Muslim world. And then there's a chapter at the end, a kind of epilogue, where I build a kind of bridge between 1800 and the present day. Or not actually exactly the present day, more like sometime, I forget when, in 2022, when I cease to be able to make significant changes to the book. But I emphasize it's a fairly narrow bridge. The systematic treatment is from the beginning to about 1800. And as you might expect, it starts by telling a single story, the story of the emergence of the Muslim world. But by the time I get to the 10th century, the story is breaking up into regional components, and that's the way it continues down to 1800. Okay, so that tells you roughly what I cover. Let me now say something about how I go about covering it. And the first thing I want to say here is that I'm just a historian. I'm emphatically not a public intellectual. I see my task as telling you to the best of my ability what actually happened in the past. I don't see myself as looking to the past to put it in the service of the present. Just to give you a concrete example, I mean, let's take relations between Muslims and Hindus in India before 1800. And I have a chapter on India, and I talk quite a lot about that there. But I mean, if you have present-day concerns that mean that you want to look back on that history of Hindu-Muslim relations and imagine it as they're being on bad terms with each other the whole time, you're not going to like that chapter. And equally, if you're from present-day concerns, you want to look back and say, before 1800 it was paradise, Hindus and Muslims got along just fine. Equally, you're not going to like my chapter. What you get in my chapter is a jarring mix of accommodation and hostility. And it's the jarring mix that I believe was actually there. So that's that aspect of what I'm doing. And you could say that I'm kind of rather puritanical about my role as a historian. You know, historians are people who have some respect for the autonomy of the past. They don't just see it as a kind of adjunct to the present. But there's another respect in which I'm not in the least puritanical. Maybe I can sort of work around to this by saying, let me see how I got it here. Yeah, one of the things that I very consciously do in the book is I don't always look at things from the same distance. I zoom in and I zoom out. So sometimes I'm giving you broad outlines, and sometimes I'm giving you detailed close-ups. And those detailed close-ups, there's a couple of reasons why they're there. One is, of course, that a detailed close-up is a way to make a big abstract point in a small concrete way. That's one reason they're there. And the other reason is I want to take full advantage of the colorfulness of human history in the Muslim world as elsewhere. Let's approach it this way. An awful lot of human history consists of humans being at cross purposes with each other. They're kind of a bit like a colony of ants, where half the colony is building, trying to build a nest in one place, and the other half is trying to tear the nest down and build it in some other place. A lot of human history is like that. But even when that's all humans are doing, they're much more interesting than ants because they have imagination. They say things. They say smart, insightful things. And because I'm dealing with one of the world's great literate civilizations, I have at least some record of the things that people said. And I'm pulling them in and bringing them into my presentation as often as I can. So let me just give you a couple of examples of that. Let me take my favorite Spanish Muslim, or at least my favorite male Spanish Muslim. This guy had his life upended by the Christian reconquest of Spain. So in 1243, a Christian king is saying to him, "Yeah, you're a good guy, we like you. Why don't you just convert to Christianity and stay on here and be one of us?" And he responds with a polite no, or somewhat polite no, and then he leaves. And the somewhat polite no goes like this. "All my life," he says, "I've tried my best to serve one God, just one God, and I've done a really lousy job of it. I just don't think I've got what it would take to serve three gods." So you can see why he's one of my favorites. But let me also admit that some of my close-ups are distinctly philological. There's one place where I quote a whole sentence in a foreign language, where, let's see, we're in Tripoli, the Tripoli in North Africa that is currently trying to be the capital city of Libya, not very successfully. But we're back in the later 17th century, and Tripoli is a kind of outpost of the Ottoman Empire, and it's governed by a pasha. And because there's a lot of Mediterranean trade going on, and the English are part of that, there's an English consul in Tripoli. But what about communication between the pasha and the English consul? Well, there's a big problem, namely that the pasha doesn't know English, and the consul doesn't know either Turkish or Arabic, which the pasha would speak. They don't have a common natural language. So what they do is they speak to each other in the lingua franca of the Mediterranean. This is a kind of pidgin that has developed in the medieval Mediterranean, whereby people who live around the Mediterranean and don't share a natural language can communicate with each other. And here is what the pasha says to the English consul. He says, "Signor Consule, perché non restar a casa tua quando estar sacran?" In other words, "Mr. Consul, why don't you stay in your house when you're drunk?" Now, the philological payload of that diplomatic utterance is that we have there, you maybe already sensed this, we have there a sentence of 12 words. Of those 12 words, 11 derive from Romance. That's to say, they derive from the languages of the Christians of the northern Mediterranean. Only one word derives from Arabic, the language of the southern coast of the Mediterranean, and that word is sakran, drunk. Now, so what that dramatizes is the fact that the Mediterranean commercial scene in that period, and quite some time before that, was one heavily, overwhelmingly dominated by Christians from the north, not by Muslims from the south. Now, in comparative terms, that's actually quite unusual, at least until the appearance of the European Christians all over the place. Like if you take West Africa or you take the Indian Ocean, overwhelmingly it's Muslim merchants who cross the frontiers and venture into non-Muslim territory. And it's, of course, no coincidence that relations between the Muslim world and the European Christians would lead to the biggest single discontinuity in the history of the Muslim world since its beginning. Okay, at this point I should really start to wind up. There's one other thing that I would like to touch on. It's kind of a preemptive response to a question somebody might ask me. Namely, what is the bottom line of your book? What is the basic claim that you're making? And the answer, of course, is that there isn't one. I mean, to have a grand unified theory of the whole of the history of the Muslim world would be a grand unified mistake. On the other hand, you will find scattered through the book more local bottom lines, more local claims that I make. And some of these are simply my dissent from currently prevailing views. Like, for example, I say that there was an Arab ethnic identity before the rise of Islam, which is currently unfashionable. And I also say that the Ottoman Empire did decline in the 17th century, which is something that these days you shouldn't say in polite society. So I beg to differ, and there are bottom lines like that. But there are also things that at least I think are my own invention. Like I have a schema of the 3 potential imperial heartlands of the Middle East, and I come back to it again and again in explaining the long-term evolution of Middle Eastern geopolitics. But just to finish up, the one particular idea, bottom line, that you'll find if you start reading the book is something that I owe entirely to someone else. I owe it to the financier Nicholas Taleb, who something like 10 or 15 years ago published a book called The Black Swan, and it was quite a big splash at the time. I'm sure some of you remember it. And in that book, he outlines a concept or a metaphor of a black swan event. And on page 11 of the book, he names the rise of Islam as an example of such a black swan event. And I think he's absolutely right, and I've incorporated that fairly conspicuously into the early chapters of the book. Okay, it's really time now for me to stop talking. Let me just quickly finish off by saying that it took me a long time to write this book, but it was fun doing it. And I know that if you were to read the whole of the book, it would take you a long time, but I'd like to think that some of it at least would be fun to read. And the crucial fact is, of course, you don't have to read the whole book. You only have to read the bits that actually interest you. And at this point, I sit down and hand over to Sadaf.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that presentation, summary, for writing and sharing your comprehensive research and knowledge on the Muslim world through this text. You start the text with a lot of foundational information about pre-Islamic Arabia, and that's not always the case when we hear about the history of Islam. Some might just start with the life of Muhammad. And so I'm curious, what do you hope readers and those in the audience would remember about pre-Islamic Arabia as we try to understand and conceptualize the emergence of Islam?
Right. I think what I most want them to remember is what a desert tribal society is like. Two things in particular. One, that the capacity for military and political action is very widely diffused. This is a very high participation society, a much higher level of political participation than we have, say, in advanced countries at the present day. But on the other hand, it's very, very hard for anyone to integrate that military and political energy into a large-scale enterprise. Almost impossible. Now that this character of desert tribal society is something I want the reader to remember throughout the early decades of the history of Islam, in the lifetime of the Prophet, under his immediate successors, under the Umayyad dynasty that follows on. It should be there in mind, so to speak. But then the other thing is, I think the character of this tribal society, it kind of explains, or it constitutes the first half of my Black Swan event, in the sense that this is an environment in which creating a state looks virtually impossible. And the fact is, it happened. And if that's not a Black Swan event, what is?
Thank you. In reference to the cult of the Virgin Mary and the worship of saints and images in Byzantine times, you write, quote, "If polytheism rather than monotheism was the default religion of the human race, we can plausibly infer that it was well attuned to basic human needs. That is why Christianity, and not just Christianity, has a perennial tendency to create within itself the comforts and conveniences of paganism." And then thinking later in the book, you, in your discussion of India, talk about this text, the Madhumalati, and how in this text it praises Muhammad, the successors of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, but then it also describes Muhammad as the king of three worlds, and that the idea that there are three worlds is Hindu, not Muslim, and that it speaks also about how God created them in the one sound, Om, and that this poem is saturated with Hindu religious, historical, and aesthetic references. So I was wondering if you would basically agree that this is also the case in Muslim history, that there's a perennial tendency to create within itself the comforts and conveniences of paganism or incorporating other religious ideologies.
Yeah, I think absolutely yes. Let me first put a bit more concretely what I was saying about Christianity. And I'll do this in terms of a reminiscence of a couple of events that happened a few years back. My wife and I were traveling in the Peloponnese in southern Greece. And on each of these occasions, we got into a car accident. We weren't driving, of course, it was somebody else's fault, actually. But we were involved. And the first time, there was a car that picked us up, and a lady in the car said to us, "You have to understand that that part of the road is supervised by St. George. You have to go into town and light a candle to St. George. It's not thank God we were safe, it's thanks to St. George." And then the other time we got into an accident, we had to go and see the police afterwards, and the policeman explained that that part of the road is under the supervision of Our Lady of the Myrtle Grove. So once again, you have this somebody very close, immediate, and specific, and that's the kind of thing I have in mind. And obviously, if we go to Islam, the moment we start getting saint cults, the moment we get people going to tombs, to pray to a saint, we have the same thing happening. I mean, there's a basic sense, I think, that normal humans are very liable to have, that God is kind of remote. He's way up there. He can't really be paying attention to me. I need somebody who can get his attention, somebody whose attention I can get and who can then get God's attention. And I think that's basically what's happening with these tomb cults. And then, of course, you get the strict monotheists, people like the Wahhabis, getting extremely upset about this and lots of controversy. But I think, yes, the basic pattern is the same. The one thing I would say about the passage from India you quoted, I mean, that's more like an elite thing, isn't it? It's not, the common people probably don't think quite like that. But this is a sophisticated Muslim engaging sophisticatedly with Hinduism.
Thank you. As you mentioned, throughout the text, you then zoom in and zoom out, and you look at these different traditions. So I'm trying to whet the appetite of the audience here today. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the idea that you mentioned in the text, the Shahnameh is, quote, the whole history of the Persians, and the Quran of the nation. And I thought that concept really spoke to Iranian and Persian interaction with Muslim civilization.
Yes, right. Yeah, I think on the whole that Iranian nationalists who read my book will be displeased from time to time, but not totally displeased. And that, yes, is a remarkable quotation coming from a medieval scholar who talks about the Iranian Book of Kings, which is a record of the pre-Islamic history of Iran. Those are all pagan kings. In religious terms, they're no good at all, but nevertheless, they're one of the glories of Iran, and that memory of that glory continues into Islamic times and down to the present day. And that, I'm not, to be honest, completely sure what Ibn al-Athir meant when he said it's the Quran of the people. Did he mean it's kind of like a revealed text that they believe in? Or did he mean maybe that it's a text used to teach school kids, which is, and one of the major roles of the Quran is you learn it in primary school. It's beaten into you in primary school. And I mean, it could be that it had some role like that in the case of Iran, but I don't know that that's the case.
Similarly, going now to a different group of people, there seems to have been shared this common quote attributed to the Prophet that the Muslim community should, quote, leave the Turks alone as long as they leave you alone, which I thought was quite interesting. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the impact of Turkic tribes on Muslim history, which is Turkic tribes on Muslim history, and that's a large part of the book, but if you just wanted to speak about it a little bit.
Right. I mean, I think what I said earlier about the coming of the Europeans, the Western Europeans, being the biggest single discontinuity in the history of the Muslim world, I think that's right, I go by it. But if you wanted to look for the second biggest, it would be the coming of the steppe peoples. And first the Turks, and then the Karakai, and then the Mongols, and then the Uzbek. I mean, there's a whole sort of slew of them. Now that doesn't have that much impact on, let's say, anything to the west of Egypt. You do get a West African ruler who, while he's passing through Cairo on pilgrimage, he buys himself, I think, 20 Turkish slaves to take back. And he obviously sees this as a real prestige item. And he's got lots of gold because that's what is produced in his part of the world. So he invests in these Turkish slaves, takes them home. You get them turning up in Morocco. But I mean, where they have a big impact is the Middle East and obviously Central Asia. And I mean, in religious terms, the impact isn't that great, in the sense that the Turks have already picked up Islam before they enter the Middle East. The Mongols have not, and there's some very queasy decades from a Muslim point of view when the Mongols are still pagans or they're playing around with Buddhism, stuff like that. But in due course, the Mongols in the Middle East do become Muslims like everybody else. But you do, and quite apart from the trauma of Mongol conquest, which was clearly, I mean, the Turks weren't particularly pleasant to be conquered by, but the Mongols were absolutely awful. But apart from that, and there's one particular Mongol legacy that has created a lot of tension with Islam, and that is, and Genghis Khan is reputed to have composed a law book with Mongol law. Now, for a culture where, in principle, the only legislator is God, that is really very problematic. But nevertheless, such was the prestige of the Mongols that that concept of, if you like, ruler's law, secular law, that concept lasts for centuries in the Muslim world, to an extent down to modern times. So that, when you have 20th century fundamentalists complaining about the adoption of Western law codes in the Muslim world, one of the things they talk about is how this happened once before in the days of the Mongols. And then they quote a great authority who said that the Mongols were unbelievers for doing this, and they then import that into their discourse on the present day. Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering about your decision or the way that you depict the schism in Islam in terms of between Sunni ideas of history and Shia ideas of history. And I'm thinking about a quote from when you're talking about Hussein's rebellion against Yazid, and you mention it as no more than a sideshow at the time. And as you say, I think certain people might not be too pleased with that description, but I wanted to talk a little bit about that schism and in your understanding of how it impacted things at the time versus its significance in later centuries.
What was the context in which I said sideshow?
That was Hussein's rebellion against Yazid when you were talking about it at that time versus its implications and
significance. Okay, right, yeah, so there I'm distinguishing between the relative triviality of an event in the context of the hardball politics of the time and its tremendous resonance down the centuries. And I think, this, the Sunni Shiite split is a deep split. It's one that has a lot of emotional resonance to it. It's certainly comparable to the split between Catholicism and Protestantism in the European context. And it's one that had a lot of influence on politics. One thing I talk about, for example, is what it has meant for Iran to become Shiite roughly around about 1500 or in the 16th century. And on the one hand, you can see it, I think quite rightly, as giving a certain religious coherence to Iran, but on the other hand, it meant certainly the potential and often the actuality of bad, poisoned relations with neighbors. So that when you have, for example, the Uzbeks, who are the last of these tribal invaders of the Middle East, they never actually conquer Iran, but they raid deep into Iran, and they take lots of peasants from Iran prisoner, and then enslave them. Now, basically, enslaving other Muslims is something you are not allowed to do. It happens, but you're definitely not supposed to do it. But they're doing it in good conscience, because as far as they're concerned, those Shiites are not Muslims at all. So this is a big deal. Although, you have to balance this with the way in which from time to time these people get along perfectly well together.
So zooming out a little bit, the story of the Muslim world seems to be this ongoing tale of contestation, schisms, and political conflict. And I was wondering if, from your understanding, there's something specific about how that takes place in Muslim societies, or it is just, this is how it happens in the Muslim world, but the similar things were happening in the same way in Christian majority societies, for example.
Right. I would say it's the second, that there is nothing very peculiar about this, that we can easily parallel it in the Christian case. And I think also, if we take the Hindu case, there is a tendency for people to think that all Hindus got along with infinite tolerance of each other. And you actually go to the record and it's not quite like that. I mean, they too can fight each other, tear down each other's temples and things like that. There's an interesting, I think it's 10th century Hindu Sanskrit play from Kashmir that's exactly about this question: which other Hindus you can tolerate and which ones you can't tolerate, which of them are okay, which of them should be squashed without any remorse. I think this is something pretty widespread. Maybe it's a bit, I think it's rather different in East Asia. I mean, you certainly can get, sectarian conflict there, but I think there is more of a sense that, Confucians are not that interested in other people's religions, provided they behave themselves.
So you've also written that the only way you could write such a text on the history of the Muslim world was to leave most of it out. And I'm wondering what you hope to look at in future works, or what do you hope future scholars will research in the future?
Okay, so there's me and there's future scholars. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I don't see myself as living forever. So that, I have to be realistic about what I might do in the future. And also, I don't want to continue writing into my dotage. I prefer to quit while I'm still at least somewhat ahead. So what I have in mind is just one book that I might write. I'm going to try very hard to make it a short book. I don't know if I'll succeed. But this would be a comparative book, not just Islam, but also bringing in, say, Western Europe and East Asia. And the theme is the role of states, or lack of it, in shaping the cultures of their societies. Whether states think they're entitled to push the culture around, whether they think they own it, or whether they regard it as something it's not quite their business. They patronize it maybe, but they don't try to change it or shape it. And there are lots of interesting contrasts there. Let me just give you one very quickly. In, I forget, 1900-something, when the last emperor of China came to the throne, 2 military cadets in the Peking Military Academy had to change their names because their names coincided with that of the new emperor. They were not entitled to keep their names when the emperor had that name. And that is something that goes very deep in Chinese society. If you took the examinations in late imperial China to join the civil service, there was, I think, a list of 18 characters that you should on no account use. You use those characters, you will not get a job, because they were characters that were part of the names of the emperors of the dynasty. Now, in the Muslim world, there is one very faint parallel to that, which is, if I'm in front of the caliph, and my name is Ahmad, and his name is Ahmad, and the caliph says to me, "Who are you?" I cannot say Ahmad. That's his name. And I have to forfeit the name in that context. But whereas in China, it's in writing all over China that you're supposed to observe these taboos. In the case of the Muslim world, this is a real kind of eccentric rarity that I'm very proud of having found, but it doesn't tell you anything deep about the culture. So there's things like that that I would think of doing something about. When it comes to what other scholars might do, scholars less advanced in years than me, fine. I mean, it's terrific. And I think our field, you know, if you're working on, I don't know, the history of 19th century Tennessee or 20th century Scotland, you're probably going to have a hard time finding some big body of evidence that nobody has really touched before. So you're going to end up deconstructing stuff and then somebody will reconstruct it. But in our field, we can do that, but we don't have to do it. There is just plenty of room for a young scholar to stake out a bit of territory, write a monograph about it. That's so far the only monograph published on that subject. So I think the prospects are still very bright for young people in this field. And one thing I would particularly like to see, somewhere in the preface, I say, I don't attempt any systematic coverage of economic or social history because I don't know how to do it in the case of the history of the Muslim world. And I'd like to think that somebody, partly by a lot more research being done and partly by people thinking about it, that they will find a way to do it.
And this question just is about what sources you actually enjoy engaging with the most, or is there a source that you were able to use in this text that you just really enjoy?
Right. I think I can think of two kinds of source. One is just sources that tell great stories. Classical Arabic stories are often told with a kind of pithiness and economy that, when you get the point, makes them very telling indeed. And I'm tempted to give you a couple of examples, but I probably shouldn't.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead and give you one. There's a lovely story told by a chronicler who's not particularly respected for his literary talents, but I mean, he was okay. But he tells this story terrifically. It's something I mentioned in some video I had to make for the press. In the 11th century, we have an Arab caliph in Baghdad. Now, being an Arab caliph in Baghdad in the 11th century wasn't that great, because there weren't too many people who paid any attention to you. There weren't too many people who paid any taxes to you. It was hard times. The people who were getting all the attention and all the taxes were the Turks, the Seljuk dynasty. And so the caliph has this very smart idea. Wouldn't it be great if I married a Turkish princess? Then I would have a hotline to the Seljuk Sultan, who actually rules the world, unlike me. Very good thinking. So he had a vizier, just like the Sultan had a vizier. So he sent the vizier, the caliph sent his vizier to go and approach the Sultan's vizier about a marriage to the daughter of the Sultan. And it so happened that at that point, the Sultan's vizier, he was miffed at something the caliph's vizier had done, and he wasn't about to be helpful. So when the caliph's vizier came to him, this is in Isfahan up in Iran, the Seljuk capital, the caliph's vizier arrives, and he says to the Sultan's vizier, "No, we'd like to arrange this marriage." The Sultan's vizier says, "Look, if you want to talk about the girl, you have to go and talk to her mother." And the Abbasid, the caliph's vizier says, "Talk to her mother? I mean, nobody does that in polite society in Baghdad. It's just not how things are done." And the caliph's vizier says, "Look, you want the girl, go talk to her mother. You don't want her, stop wasting my time." And so the what can you do when you've fallen on evil days and no taxes are coming in? The caliph's vizier goes and talks to the girl's mother. And the girl's mother is a very formidable lady. She actually has an army of 10,000 troops at her disposal, which she's about to use in a civil war. And when the caliph's vizier comes to see her, she says, "Oh, you've got to understand that every ruler within shouting distance wants to marry my daughter. And, the going rate is pretty high. Now, for you, maybe 40,000 dinars, 40,000 gold coins." So the caliph's vizier says, "Yeah, okay, but I can't actually hand it all over in cash right now. Would it be okay if I went back, if I just paid you a down payment and went back and sent the money from Baghdad?" And she says, "Yeah, okay, do that." But then he can't even raise the down payment in Isfahan, because no banker there regards him, the caliph, as sufficiently creditworthy. So he has to go back in humiliation. And I think there's some bargaining to and fro about the actual sum. I forget how much is eventually paid. But anyway, eventually this marriage takes place, success. The caliph now has a Turkish princess for his wife. But she doesn't like him. I mean, her mother had actually imposed a very stringent clause in the marriage contract that said the caliph may not have any other wives or concubines, just my daughter, right? So the poor caliph, he has only this one wife, no concubines, and his one wife doesn't like him. And after a while, she decides she dislikes him so much that she leaves. She goes back home to her mum and dad and tells them her grievance story, and that makes them very embittered against the caliph. And the caliph, after that, he sends a message to, sorry, not the sultan, the Turkish sultan, he sends a message to the caliph in Baghdad saying, "Oh, by the way, I think I'm going to take Baghdad to be my winter capital. So you just have to move out. Go anywhere you want. You just get out of there." And this is the one point at which the caliph has a bit of luck. Before that can happen, the sultan dies, and the Seljuks are plunged into a succession crisis and there's civil war. And the caliph can breathe again and maybe acquire some wives and concubines. So that's a story that is told terrifically in a fairly mediocre source. Others are even better.
I think maybe at this point I'll open up the floor to questions from the audience.
Okay, and at this point I wanted to say that one of my other disabilities is hearing. I never was that good at it, and I'm worse at it now. So that if I don't hear your question, somebody's going to relay it to me. So, I mean, if that happens, it's not your fault, it's my fault, okay?
I'll also ask for you to wait for me to bring you the microphone before asking any questions, so we'll take a show of hands for questions. I see one in the back.
Thank you for the great talk, Professor Cook, and for moderating Dr. Jaffer. One question is, granted you went through basically all of Muslim history, if there was one Muslim ruler who you would be willing to be an advisor for, who would that be? And if there was one Muslim ruler you would never be an advisor for, who would that be?
One Muslim ruler.
If there was one Muslim ruler who you would want to be an advisor for, who would that be? And then if there's one Muslim ruler who you would never want to be an advisor for, who would that be?
Okay, I think the ruler that I would want to be an advisor for would be the Mughal ruler Akbar in India. And I found him one of the most sympathetic rulers that I've written about. Now, I've tried not to be too judgmental one way or the other with these rulers, but there is something about him. I mean, he's somebody who has, as well as political skill, I think, real political imagination. And he's the one who, for example, you have in sort of northwestern India, you have the Rajputs, who are Hindu rulers, and you've had a lot of bad blood between them and Muslim rulers, and things don't start off at all well between the Mughals in Akbar's dynasty and the Rajputs. But somehow Akbar is able to flip the Rajputs, and he does it by a combination of giving them a real measure of autonomy, not infinite autonomy, but a real measure of autonomy, plus that crucial commodity, respect. So, for example, when Akbar marries a Rajput daughter, she comes to court, to the court of the Muslim ruler, with her Hindu chaplain, so to speak, and in her quarters she can perform the full range of Hindu rites. So that there's a real sense of respect there, getting respect. And this is something that then goes sour. So maybe I should pick Aurangzeb as the ruler I would least like to be advisor to. He was the one who, I think in a very real way, messed things up. He did it in two ways, actually. One was within his own elite. He banned the drinking of wine. Now, wine was, so to speak, Mughal social life didn't exist without wine. And this was socially very disruptive to ban wine at the Mughal court. But the other thing is that he did things that alienated the Hindus on a pretty large scale. Like Akbar, there's that special tax that non-Muslims are supposed to, non-Muslims pay to the Muslim state to be tolerated. Now, Akbar abolished that. As far as he was concerned, we tolerate the Hindus without us paying any special tax. We're going to pay taxes like anyone else. That went down well. Aurangzeb, who went more by kind of the Muslim rule book, he reversed that. And that then created a lot of bad feeling. In the same way, he rubbed the Rajputs up the wrong way. So yeah, he's the one I'd want to avoid.
Thank you so much, Professor Cook. I'm over here. So you spend a lot of time reading historians, and you are a historian. And I wonder how you see the relationship between these two modes of doing history. So the ways in which your sources are doing history, and the ways in which you are writing history. What is it about the imagination of historical time and place? And then a kind of corollary to that, how do you think the field itself is changing? Because it seems to have changed just over your long and prolific career. So, from a kind of, old school Orientalism, as it were, to, the post-Edward Sayidian, and now that you have so many, Muslim historians from the Muslim world themselves, for example, who are reading these sources, how do you think, those relationships between the historian in the 21st century today at Princeton is to the historian whose texts are left in the seafloor of Firestone in the manuscripts that we read today?
Right, so essentially there were two questions there, right?
Yeah, the first one was, you read a lot of text by historians over Islamic history. What do you think about their work and their perspective as compared to your work and your perspective on the history as a historian? And then just was seeking some thoughts on how the field of history has changed over your career. And was there anything else? That's good, okay.
Right. Okay, so why I write history and why they wrote history, and the sources in the pre-modern past. Yeah, right. I mean, what I do is, in a real sense, is in many ways different. but I'm not sure it's that fundamentally different. Particularly, maybe here I'm taking an exception. If I take Ibn Khaldun, I mean, I think if I could get together with the ghost of Ibn Khaldun and we could have long talks about the history of the Muslim world, I don't think we'd spend very much time simply not understanding each other's cultures. And I think, I mean, a lot of the same, Ibn Khaldun is a bit of an exception, but if you take somebody like Miskawayh in the 11th century, writing about what's going wrong in the Abbasid administration, I mean, basically he's thinking about it the same way that I think about it. And I think, okay, I'm not putting this very well, but I think we have a tendency greatly to exaggerate the extent to which there are real differences between human cultures. I think a lot of it, if you're human, is very much in common. And I think, the fundamental purposes of a historian trying to explain why this ruler was successful, that ruler was not, why this invasion took place. And there's really a lot that we in the Historians Guild have in common. And so that's a kind of patchy answer to your first question. Second question, yes. The field has changed very drastically. By no means completely, in that the existence of the British Raj in India meant that there were people writing history who came from England and who were indigenous Indians, kind of side by side, that you had Indians writing history in English. So, I mean, there isn't a kind of total separation there, but things have changed dramatically, yes, in the sense that now for the entire history of the Muslim world, I would say that, if you simply take the most recent 50 monographs, I don't know what the figure would be, but I would suspect that maybe 30 of them were written by Muslims. So that is a very big change. But in one way, it's not, I think, a very big change, in that overwhelmingly, I think, the Muslims who write the history of the Muslim world in English at the present day are doing it in a way that you could describe as fundamentally secular. They're not pushing a religious narrative. Maybe as with the origins of Islam, that becomes a more delicate matter, but dynasties up and down the centuries, I don't think there's that much difference. So although it's a world in which the names have changed a lot, my sense is that the substance hasn't changed all that much.
Thank you for your talk. It was very enlightening. Do you see any connection between the Wahhabist theology and the political reality of absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia, or are they two different concepts?
Okay, I think I got that, yes. I don't, okay. First of all, I mean, at the level of the way in which the relationship between Wahhabism and the Saudi dynasty was conceptualized, and I don't think there is anything that intrinsically required that monarchy to be an absolute monarchy. And, this is an alliance between a religious reformer who knows best about all religious questions and the sort of chieftain of one particular oasis in Arabia, who thanks to this alliance is going to come to rule a much larger territory. I don't see it at that stage as an absolute monarchy. And in particular, I think, just as a generalization, you can't mount an absolute monarchy in a desert tribal society before very modern times. It just doesn't work. Now, has the Saudi monarchy become an absolute monarchy? Well, I would say for a very long time it didn't. That is to say that partly because of the residue of the tribal society, a ruler like Ibn Saud, who ruled in the first half of the 20th century, part of what makes him such an effective ruler is that he's paying a lot of attention to what different people want, and he's keeping a lot of people at least moderately happy. Every now and again there's somebody you can't keep happy, and then you have a crunch. But he's doing his best to keep a lot of people happy. And I think that this it changed in a way with the coming of oil, revenues on a really large scale. But again, Saudi rulers, until the one who's actually ruling the country now, I think tended to be very cautious. And they didn't want to get out of line with too much public opinion. They were cautious rulers. So they're not throwing their weight around as absolute rulers. It's MBS who is perhaps the first absolute ruler in Saudi Arabia, and who shows it by really pushing people around in unprecedented ways.
I see a couple more questions. We're okay for time? You guys you're comfortable taking a couple more, or?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, okay.
Why did you cut off your study at 1800 instead of continuing further on? Is there a major break in Islamic civilization around that time?
Right. Okay, let me make that two questions. One is what caused me to stop in 1800, and the other is what justification can I give for it. If I take the justification first, when I spoke about the greatest discontinuity in the history of the Muslim world, what I'm talking about is the impact of the West and what that does to the Muslim world. And I think that is something that it builds up gradually. But I mean, round about 1800 is when the impact really becomes severe, and the need to adapt in fairly radical ways is becoming increasingly obvious. So that would be my justification. In terms of causality, well, it's partly that I'm more of a medievalist than a modernist. But I would have to admit that to teach undergraduates, if I was going to have any undergraduates sitting in front of me teaching just medieval history wouldn't have worked. I had to also teach them modern history. So that I do know a certain amount of modern Middle Eastern Muslim history. But had I gone on and tried to deal just as systematically with the history of the last 200 years, I'm not sure I would have finished the book in my lifetime, and it would have been 2 volumes like this. So I was kind of relieved to have an excuse to stop.
Let me move forward from Aurangzeb and Akbar to a more modern question about India and your thesis that in general the Muslim faith is secular or more secular than otherwise. My question is, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who led the Muslim movement in India, was a very close friend and associate of both Mr. Gandhi and Mr. Nehru, Hindus. But when it came time for independence in 1947, he was absolutely committed to Pakistan and would not budge unless and until, in some form, Pakistan came into being. Do you have any thoughts about the historical or the religious context of Mr. Jinnah's very strong position, given a lifetime of being a member of a secular team?
Right. Okay. First of all, let me say that it's not completely unlike the case of Moses, the prophet Moses. There we have somebody who was, it seems, a fully assimilated member of the Egyptian elite. It just, he happened to have this Jewish ancestry, but he's brought up in the palace. And so in that sense, he's like Jinnah. But equally, when push comes to shove, he leads a secession from Egypt of his blood group, so to speak. And so, I mean, this is something that I think you get. I'm not sure whether that was a historical instance, but I think this is a pattern that gets repeated in history. That people who share a culture but have a quite different sort of ethnic origin or religious origin may well split from the people they share the culture with. Of course, what is odd is that, I mean, if Jinnah had represented an ethnic group, I think we would understand it more easily than the fact that he's representing a religious group, a group defined by its membership in a religion. But how can I put this? Okay, and one, to my mind, interesting thing about Jinnah is that in his library he had several books about Zionism. He was very interested in Zionism because this was another case where a religious group had managed to form a state. And that's what he was trying to do. Now, when I say a religious group, what I mean there is that Jinnah's constituency are people who happen to be born Muslims. It's not that they're particularly pious Muslims, and certainly he wasn't. I mean, he married a Zoroastrian woman, didn't he, a Parsi. But Jinnah, I think, despite being a rather obviously secular character, he never actually put this into a pithy statement. But someone who did was, what's his name, Rizvi, who was the leader of a Muslim militia in Hyderabad, that state of India, now part of India,
Shia.
where the ruler tried to maintain his independence of the new state of India, and signally failed. And this militia, this Muslim militia, was attempting to preserve the independence of Hyderabad under Muslim rule. And the leader of this militia, at one point in an interview, he said, "Everywhere where there are Muslims, our hearts reach out in sympathy to them. Even if Muslims in hell were in trouble, our hearts would reach out to them." So in other words, he's not in the least concerned about piety. He's concerned about Muslims as members of a group, and that's it. And I think with Jinnah, it's basically the same.
Okay, at that point. Sorry, can you hear me okay? I think the mic's not working. But at this point, I think we'll thank our guests with a round of applause.